Good. I am the moderator. I'm Carl Cannon. Chris Jackson's here. Chris came up to Washington to do politics many years ago. Now he does polling for Ipsos. We're lucky to have him. Sean Trende is the senior political analyst for RealClearPolitics. We're going to talk about presidential politics, but since I paid attention to what you've been talking about, we don't want to go so suddenly from airline issues into politics that you get the bends. So we're going to talk to Chris about a poll he did about the airline industry. And then we're going to segue into politics. Chris knows politics too, so he's going to participate in the presidential. You'll do that with us, right?
Yeah. Talk
presidential politics with us?
That's right.
All right. Good. Let's talk about your airline poll for a minute. So you found 81% of people express satisfaction with their flying experience.
That's right, yeah. So we did a survey of about 3,000 Americans about their travel experiences in 2015. Of those, about 45% said they'd flown in that year, in 2015. And among that 45% who'd flown, 80%, more than 80%, were satisfied with the experience they had, which I think sort of gives a little bit of a lie to the whole thing that people hate air travel. Actually, you know, the large majority of people are generally satisfied with their experience flying from point A to point B with America's commercial aviation.
Now, Chris, I came to Washington many years ago as a reporter. My first job was in the National Press Building here, and we were trained to be skeptics. Obviously, your polling is first rate, but every time somebody comes back from a campaign trip, one of my reporters, they tell me a horror story about their flight. So now that's anecdotal. That's not scientific, but square those two.
Yeah, and for me. That's a great point. And the difference is we weren't necessarily asking people about every leg of every flight of all the travel they took in the year. We're asking them about the whole totality of their experience flying in 2015. And when you sort of have people sort of take that step back and sort of look at the experience as a whole, they're actually pretty happy with it. You know, if we ask them, well, that flight you took from DC to Columbus, how'd you like that? Well, then they'd be like, well, you know, actually we were delayed leaving and the weather was bad and I didn't like that and anything else. But when you ask them, did you like how the airlines have helped you get around the country? People are happy.
Now, the last major poll is 20 years ago.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was mentioning my reporters they travel for business. People in this room travel for business. But what's the mix now? Has it changed in the 20 years since the Gallup poll? People traveling more for pleasure? That's my impression.
Yeah. So the last time a similar study was done was 97. So almost 20 years ago, and the nature of air travel has changed dramatically in that time. In 97, the data we have from that study really indicates that air travel was still mostly white, mostly male, mostly older, more affluent, and was really business focused. It was people who were traveling for work. And in the last 20 years, it's really changed to be a much more broad slice of America. Essentially, it is the democratization of air travel, if you will, where it is a lot of people who look just like regular Americans. It's young people, it's minorities, it's not quite as affluent people, it's people with families, and they're traveling for personal and leisure reasons. They're not necessarily traveling for business. They're traveling because they want to get around, you know, this country or even around the world for their own purposes.
Do they have to wear shorts and sandals and muscle shirts, though?
We don't have any data on that. I think that's entirely based on taste.
Before we go to politics, maybe a segue question. Deregulation had an effect. It mattered.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it certainly seemed to help open up access to air travel to a lot of people who, before that point, weren't really enjoying it. And now we have essentially the number of people who flew in 2015, about 45% of Americans, only slightly less than the 55% of Americans will probably vote in the upcoming presidential election. So that's sort of the breadth of air travel that we have, people traveling by air.
All right, so that's a good transition, Sean. Wait a minute, you flew today.
I had a great flight.
Okay.
Part of my 80%.
That's right.
So we've got a new poll out today. These guys were talking about it in the green room. What's the latest poll on Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton?
So the LA Times tracker comes out daily, and it's been fairly favorable to Trump, so I don't know that you want to look at the top line number. It has Trump up 3 now.
As of today?
As of today. What's interesting is that, like I said, it's generally Trump positive, so you got to adjust for that. It's the trend line, because it had them tied up over the weekend. And so it suggests that the events of the weekend did have an effect. Now, you'd want to wait a couple days to validate that, but yeah, it seems like there was a shift given what happened this weekend.
A question for both of you. The election is 8 weeks from today, as everyone knows. It seems that Americans are poised to do something. I won't say they've never done it, but it's certainly rare. They're going to vote for president. There's going to be the 45th president of the United States will be chosen, and the person who's chosen will be someone that the majority of Americans do not like and do not trust.
Yeah.
Yep.
8 weeks, 1 day till we get to start talking about the 28 midterms.
That's right.
Polling guys, and political analysts.
Yeah, no, it's really jarring. I mean, you have in Hillary Clinton the candidate with the second lowest favorable ratings of any major party candidate since we've had polling data taken. And the reason that she is competitive and leading in most polls and probably favored to win is she is running against the person with the lowest favorable ratings in the history of polling data. It is really just a jarring series of data we have on that from this election. Chris?
Yeah, and I think the thing that's really interesting to sort of keep in mind, though, is that while these are two of the most unpopular people to ever run for president, both of them actually have a core of supporters who are really intensely favorable towards them. So it's certainly not a majority of the electorate, but you're going to see no matter who wins, there's going to be this core of support on the day after the election who are going to feel like they were robbed. And in Trump's case, they may actually think they were robbed, given his rhetoric.
Well, if the Russians run, will they be robbed? I mean, what am I to think of what I've been hearing? Both camps have talked about this. Stolen elections.
Yeah, so the Republican Party base has been increasingly sort of believing this sort of rhetoric of election fraud, that this is a real thing. And that sort of delegitimizes any sort of democratic government, and it sort of feeds into some of the issues we have here in DC about getting legislation passed. Essentially, if your opponent is not legitimate, then doing business with them is also not legitimate. The Democrats have responded by sort of doubling down on this whole discussion about Republicans essentially trying to disenfranchise people for political gain. And that hasn't really caught on the same way, and it doesn't necessarily have the same
And the Russian angle.
effects.
Hillary Clinton's mentioned this herself.
We haven't actually seen that bear out a lot in any of our poll data yet. But, you know.
So dueling
still time.
conspiracy theories, candidates that are not trusted, they even have the same mirror scandals. Trump University, this fraudulent thing, well then it turns out Bill Clinton was taking money from a for-profit university, a lot of money, $18 million, while the Obama administration was trying to close down other nonprofits. Question is, that begins to smell like a low turnout election.
Oh, I would be surprised if we saw anything like we saw, in 2008, much less 2012, where we had kind of 60% turnout. I think it's probably going to be a very low presidential election.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the early indications we have from sort of survey data about enthusiasm to vote indicates that turnout's going to be 2000 election levels, barely half the population showing up to vote.
Do you have any way of knowing who that helps, Trump or Clinton?
Generally, it's assumed that helps Trump. Low turnout elections favor Republicans.
You agree?
Yeah, the one asterisk on that is 2004, where
Right.
turnout went up, and Bob Shrum famously called John Kerry President Kerry because they were hitting all their turnout targets, and it turned out the Republicans had exceeded them.
Is that the shortest presidential term, 2 hours?
Yeah, something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. But the generally speaking, that's the thinking, that when turnout drops, it's lower income people who don't turn out to vote. So.
All right. Bolstering that perception, the Washington Post poll that came out on Sunday, many of you saw it, I'm sure, showed lower enthusiasm for, it had Hillary Clinton up, I think, 46-41 in the, but a lower enthusiasm for her. Again, what you're saying, but does that make the Democrats, the presumed get out the vote efforts of the Democrats, which looks on paper to be much superior to what the Republicans have this year, does that make that more important? Is that how you overcome the enthusiasm?
The amazing thing about that number, 46-41, I mean, it's September, and that means that 14% of the electorate is still undecided after what seems just like an interminable election season to a lot of us who've been covering it. And that, in 2012, at this point, the number was more like 6 or 7%.
Yeah, that's right.
That adds a whole bunch of uncertainty when you see these models, and I like the models, but the models that say, 70% chance of winning or 40% or whatever, they're built off of previous elections where a 2-point difference meant 49-47. Now we're talking about a 2-point difference that's like 45-43. So that huge number of undecideds matters a lot. But yeah, I think that the Democrats' advantage in the get out the vote effort matters. Counterbalancing that potentially is a lot of Trump's voters aren't regular voters. And by regular voters, I mean reliable voters, voted in the past. So there's a chance that they aren't getting through likely voter screens.
Chris, this online polling is the future, and it's the present at Ipsos. Another really good online poll, YouGov, spent time, Dave Brady of Stanford sent me the data over the weekend. 5,000 people, they really bored in on these undecideds. Who are they? And sort of 3 groups, people who say they're not going to vote, they'll tell you that. Or people who say that because they detest both these candidates so much. People tell you they're going to vote third party, and then undecideds. And even when pressed, but when pressed really hard, they give it up. But that group broke for Clinton, not for Trump, which made me think that, the good news for Trump is there's a lot of undecideds out there. The bad news is they don't like him either.
Right.
Is that what you're finding?
Yeah, so our data indicates that there's a lot of people out there who are undecided, like we were just saying, a lot more than we saw in 2012. And the undecided voters tend to be coming from sort of 2 camps. They are coming from sort of more moderate Republicans who just haven't been able to bite the bullet and support Trump. And those are the people who are most likely going to actually show up on election day. Maybe they vote for Trump, maybe they skip Trump and just vote down ballot. And then a larger population of people who are more marginal voters, period. People who just aren't as likely to vote, and those are the people who do lean Clinton. The challenge, I think, for Hillary Clinton would be to get those people to show up, given the fact that this is not an election where people are excited, and these aren't people that the Clinton campaign or the Democratic machinery really have a clear bead on to do their GOTV efforts towards them.
There was a great quote, I can't remember where I read it. It was over the weekend. That's what's become of my memory with this election. But they were talking to a Trump supporter with the campaign staff in Florida, and they asked something about like, well, why aren't you guys knocking doors? And the person actually said, don't you think perhaps it's a little bit archaic to say that people are going to turn out to vote for Trump these days because someone knocked on their doors? And I read that and I was like, you know what? Like, there's something to that. Like, in the modern information era, I don't know that these kind of 1950s innovations, door-knocking campaigns and lists and all that stuff, really matter as much.
Well,
there's a political science debate on this very question. This election is almost like a political scientist designed it, and maybe Neil deGrasse Tyson is right, and we do live in a simulation.
That's
right. A lot of political science theory is being tested here.
My first campaign I covered, 1984, in this building, there was a senator named Jim Sasser. Do you remember him? Mm-hmm. He held a press conference to announce that he was endorsing John Glenn, 2 Democrats. The place was packed. Well, and I remember thinking, I was just a young reporter in my 20s, I'm thinking, where is the American who's going to see that Jim Sasser endorsed John Glenn, and he's thinking, okay, now I have to go vote for John Glenn. So I'm not sure it ever really mattered as much as we thought it did, endorsements and this stuff. But if you have an organization that goes to nursing homes and community centers and places where there's Democrats, and you say to these people, drive them to the polls on election morning, look, we've seen turnout go up. And this idea that Donald Trump's simply going to rely on the Trump brand and the Clinton campaign is going to run this maybe a little retro, but very organized, very expensive, get out the vote campaign, I can't think it won't make any difference. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, and actually driving people to the polls has in past elections made a difference of a point or two in the final election tally, which in close elections is enough.
Well, a point
right?
or two is what the RealClearPolitics average is
Right,
now.
exactly. But as the point we were making earlier, with 16, 18% undecided, a point or two is still just sort of blowing into the wind to an extent. You know, we need to sort of figure out where those people are landing before knowing if the GOTV is actually going to matter.
All right, let's take a step back and be a little less wonky for a minute. If if you're an ordinary American with a job and a family and your mental health, and you say, okay, the primaries are over, summer vacation's over, it's Labor Day, I guess I have to pay attention to this presidential race. And if you're a normal person, not living in Washington maybe, you look at this and you say, all right, Trump said all these crazy and outrageous things. I'm tired of the Clintons, but I guess I have to make a choice. But I'm looking at these numbers and I want to know, how can it, as a math thing, how can it be 2 points? Trump's alienated Muslims. Gays vote Democratic. Jews vote Democratic. Hispanics and Asians, 3 to 1 Democratic. There's a gender gap now that's pretty institutionalized. And Hillary Clinton's a woman. African Americans, 90 to 95%, not the 80% of our youths. So how is this thing only 2 points?
You know, the math is what it is, and there's only one thing you can deduce from that, which is that Trump is running better than a Republican typically does among whites. That is the only way that he can be getting 15, 20% of the non-white vote and have it still be, which is about 30% of the electorate, and have it still be a 2-point race. The only other way you make that math work is if white turnout is going through the roof.
Chris?
Yeah, or if minority turnout is plummeting,
Yeah.
which is the other sort of side of the coin. And that's, I think, one of the big concerns of the Democratic Party is that a lot of the young and minority voters that turned out for Obama may not turn out for Hillary Clinton.
How about the Bernie Sanders vote? Pretty youthful vote, relatively. The Brexit vote taught us not to take young, liberal, economic progressives for granted, that we don't always know what they're going to do. What's the evidence on where we think they are?
Yeah, so the Bernie voters were very enthusiastic about the election back in March. And since Bernie has bowed out and endorsed Hillary Clinton, their enthusiasm has waned. And this age cohort, 18 to 24-year-olds, maybe 34-year-olds, if you want to be expansive, are not voters historically. They do not turn out at very high rates. I mean, that youngest group is usually maybe 25% of them actually show up on election day. And with sort of the heartbreak of Bernie bowing out, we're probably going to see very low turnout in that group.
Yeah, I mean, what Obama, especially in 2008, was so successful at, and why he was so able to get young turnout up and get a lot of people who hadn't traditionally voted to turn out to vote, it wasn't just a presidential campaign, it was a cultural event. And I think Bernie's campaign, especially in progressive communities, was the same thing. It was a cultural event. Yeah. I think part of the reason we might get surprised is that among a completely different slice of American life, Trump is a cultural event.
Yeah, that's true.
But Clinton is not a cultural event, which is odd given that she will be the first female leader of the free world if she wins, but she just hasn't tapped into culture the same way that Obama did.
Is there any chance the polls are wrong? We mentioned Brexit. They weren't really very good there. They weren't spectacularly off, but enough off that they got it wrong. The Scottish elections they got wrong. They got the British elections wrong, the Israeli elections, the governor's race in Kentucky. What am I leaving out? South Carolina?
I mean, you know.
Could they be wrong? And if so, how?
You should always read the RealClearPolitics averages, which give you the best take on what the election will be. The polls can be wrong. We've been lucky in America, not just lucky, there are structural reasons why our polls have tended to be better than polls in the United Kingdom and Canada and so forth. But you know, we also have had elections. I mean, the first election that I really paid attention to was Clinton in 1996 when the polls had him up by, you know, high double digits and he won by 9. I mean, they got the arrow right, but that's still a pretty big miss. In 2012, the polls were off enough that if they had been off from the averages in the other direction by the same amount, Romney would have won. So yes, there is a chance, if this really is a 1 or 2 point race right now, there really is a chance that just methodological errors could cause the polls systematically to be off.
And what could that be?
Yeah, so, I mean, first, polls are awesome and they're always great. The challenge, though, is that polls, particularly election polling, always works the best when the system is essentially stable, right? When you're essentially working in the same environment you've worked with in the past, so essentially all the assumptions you're bringing into the work are valid. The issue is, does Donald Trump break those assumptions this cycle, right? And that's, I think, sort of the big open question that my field is sort of wrestling with is will Trump's involvement, his candidacy, the way he's mobilizing white voters particularly, change a lot of the assumptions that we have? And it sort of comes back around to sort of turnout. Who shows up to vote? Because only about half of the country actually votes. So we have to, as pollsters, we have to essentially identify the right half. And if we identify the wrong half, then the numbers are off. If we identify the right half, but we miss it by about 5, the numbers are off. So that's actually the big challenge.
This time it's different, has a very poor track record, not just in elections, but in any type of predictive aspect. However, that was my mantra about the Republican primary in about October of 2015. So sometimes it really is different, and you cannot predict when. It's just going to change.
All right. We've been talking about national numbers. Now, as we all know, we don't have a national election. We have 50 elections, state by state, winner take all. So 51, I guess. What about, let's just talk about 2 states that they're the big swing states every year. Everybody has the list of states, you all know them, but there's 2 that matter, they're first among equals, Florida and Ohio. What's going on in those 2 states?
Right now, Clinton is in a relatively good position in both of those states, but that is potentially up for debate because of the whole "are we measuring what we think we're measuring" issue. And I think that's much more of a question in Ohio. Florida is probably a little bit safer. Clinton, the Hispanic population is larger, of course, in Florida. It's been sort of trending in that direction a little bit. Ohio, though, much larger, sort of white working class, more afflicted by trade, Trump's sort of signature issue, more afflicted by sort of the loss of a lot of manufacturing sector jobs. So that's going to be, I think, one of the real key battlegrounds.
Sean, let me ask you, doesn't Trump need both of those states?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
to win?
If we're even going to talk about Florida and Ohio, that means he's pretty much won Romney's 202, I think, electoral votes. And so it's just impossible to get to 270 without also adding Florida and Ohio. Now, when you do that, you've added about 47 electoral votes. So you get him up to 250. So if he gets those 2 states, all of a sudden he's really close.
Then if taking Chris's point aside, say Trump upset her in both of those states, then what states are we looking at to determine the next president?
I think he's up in Iowa right now.
Yeah, I think Iowa is a good place for him.
So then you're at 256.
No, I mean the states that then determine the next president.
Yeah, absolutely.
New Hampshire?
Probably Maine's 1st district.
Maine's 1st district, New Hampshire. What about New Mexico?
You know, New Mexico is one that a lot of people have written off, but we've had 2 polls. I think your 50 state had him up in New Mexico.
We had it really close, yeah.
Yeah, so...
New Mexico was admitted to the Union in 1912. You look this up, but I think it's only been wrong once or twice. So it's a sort of hidden bellwether.
Yeah. The big ones, though, these are small, like Nevada, but the big ones are, in this election, the upper Midwestern states. So Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. States that are not new economy states, that have high numbers of working class, unionized white voters who could be enticed to switch over.
How can the Republicans win Wisconsin? They couldn't even win it with Paul Ryan on the ballot.
Well, but see, this is what makes Trump it makes him interesting. One of the many things that makes him interesting is that, the Romney-Ryan ticket, it was the executive and the stockbroker. Like, that was not the ticket to appeal to people in Green Bay. Trump, Pence, you can make a stronger case. You can't convince me, but you can make a stronger case to me than I think you could with Romney-Ryan.
Well, if you're talking about the upper Midwest, then, is there any path for Trump if Hillary Clinton wins Florida? Could he carry Michigan? Is that a better state for him, Chris?
If he's able to sort of pick up Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, then he has a chance essentially in all of those states across the sort of upper Midwest, with the exception of Illinois. So I mean, I actually think that's as plausible a path for him as winning Florida and taking some of those other states.
And what's the state polling in Pennsylvania?
Our most recent has Clinton up by low single digits.
I think our average is a little higher, but the polling's really been slow. I'm kind of surprised. I thought after Labor Day it would be coming out fast, but I think our averages will catch up there.
So, I guess you have. No, you can't say. Nate Silver does these odds, which is, to me, I like to go to Vegas and bet on football and baseball. So he just puts up an odds, but there's no money there. But if you had to say the odds of this election, Chris, what would you say now?
Oh, I hate that question.
I'm a journalist.
I think just not with the assumption that anything can change, everything will probably change. I would probably say 60-40 Clinton, just based on where polls are right now. But it's close, and it's going to be close.
I say 75-25 Clinton, but people don't do probability naturally well. Like, you hear 75-25, you're like, that's a huge number. No, your odds of losing a game of Russian roulette are 17%. Okay, so when I say Trump has a 25% chance of winning, and you would never play Russian roulette. When I say Trump has a 25% chance of winning, I mean that's 1 out of every 4 times we ran an election like that, Trump would win. So that's a very real chance that he wins.
All right, and the variables we have now, the health question of the candidates, this thing over the weekend, put that into play. Trump's going to release his medical records. We don't know what that's going to show. 3 debates, we think. Trump now says he doesn't want a moderator. That would be interesting. And I don't know what Julian Assange has up his sleeve. So there are things to come that could move the polls in 8 weeks, yes or no?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Chris? All right. Well, that's the time we have. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.